Okay, thank you, everyone. I think the first question I'd like to ask our panelists is, as we look at these private-public partnerships and try to bring projects to fruition, they can be challenging, but they're also opportunities. I think we'd like to focus today on the two projects, one at Taylor Yards and one on Long Beach Boulevard. They could potentially be the Northgate Market, and the challenges, opportunities, success stories related to those projects. And we'd like Ed to jump in because he's connected to Taylor Yards and all the outreach he did there. So John, I'm gonna hand it over to you. We'll start with you. And by the way, John is, I think I can say this, an awardee of the ECRG grant, the City of Lynwood. They're working through that, but he's gonna talk a little bit about that and how that's gonna help him in this property that's had a long history and looks like it's going to move forward.
This property has a very long history. The site that we're addressing today, it's at the southeast corner of the Long Beach Boulevard and 105 freeways. And what happened to this particular site, unfortunately, when the freeway went in 1991, 1992, it really bifurcated the city of Lynwood. It created two cities there. And this was one of those remnant parcels that had some outlying uses that ultimately were gas stations, dry cleaners, and things along that line that contaminated the water, the soil, and everything else around it, including adjacent parcels. And as things would go, the property owners eventually sold the property but retained a piece, and the trust that owned it went bankrupt. So now you have a property that's been vacant that you're looking at now since probably the early 2000s. And the city has thrown money on it. The former redevelopment, you guys all remember what that was, redevelopment agencies. They tried and tried and tried, but at the end of the day, there was not enough money to motivate a development. And so it really requires what I call not a P3, but maybe more like a P5. You know, we had multiple government agencies, DTSC, the water board, the city, the county. We had everybody participating in this. And then we had to have a well-heeled and convinced developer, which happens to be Northgate Markets. They've been working diligently with the city over the last decade to try to make this happen. And they've been there pouring in money themselves along with the city and other agencies. It's a long story, but at the end of the day, we had 2 groundbreakings, and we still don't have a store. So I'm sure you're all familiar with that, but that's where you need the commitment by the public entities to want to do this. And it's really a health and safety issue because we have contamination that is sinking into the water. We have water wells within the city. So if you don't address that, you have all the other issues that are associated with that contamination. And so again, it's due to, as Tony was just indicating, that we have received approximately a $5 million award to help clean up this site and develop this market. So that's kind of the nut and bolts, and we can get into more specifics, but let me turn it over to someone else.
Yeah, Antonio, can you tell us a little bit about your development at Taylor Yards?
And I'll defer to Ed on some of the big picture and the history of Taylor Yard. It's obviously a large former rail yard. A lot of what we do as a company is working with public agencies. So we work with housing authorities, we're with transit agencies, obviously city redevelopment agencies back when they were still around. None of what we do is possible without that help, because it's not just the financial help. There's a lot that goes into it in terms of, you know, obviously identifying the sort of the site plan, what the program is. We want to make sure that we do work with the community. At the end of the day, that's our ultimate client. So we want to make sure we get that component right. Agencies like DTSC have been instrumental as well, because even though when we came to this site and this small parcel, well, parcel C of the larger Taylor Yard, had a clearance, had the NFA from DTSC, we were like, hey, you know, great, let's go. But let's do some additional sampling just to make sure. You know, a few million dollars later, we figured out, okay, there was something else that we had not yet come across. So again, having partnerships with those types of agencies is really key you can't move forward without it. And again, when you sort of establish that rapport with those agencies and they see that you're trying to do the right thing for the right population, I think that helps to facilitate the process and really make sure that at the end of the day, it's a project that everybody could look back and say, hey, it was hard, it wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Again, I'll pass it to Ed to talk about a little bit big picture. You can see the parcels up on the screen. The yellow one in the hash mark, parcel C, that's the 23-acre parcel that we developed. But as you can see, there was a lot more to Taylor Yard that Ed was instrumental on.
Thank you, Antonio. I think what's unique about this experience is that it took a lawsuit against the SCRA, Southern California Railroad Association, to understand what they were doing to our community. The maintenance yard they put there, they used one type of maintenance facility for heavy rail and light rail, and they weren't consistent in how they were doing their EIR. So when former Councilman Gloria Molina becomes County Supervisor Gloria Molina, there's a 6-month window in which they drop in this project when no one's around, taking care of the district. So Mike Hernandez becomes the council member. I, at that time, was the chief planning deputy. We triggered these legal actions. And in return, to settle, there was a dollar amount that they had to put on the table. They had to allow us access to the rivers, so we made sure a road was built. We broke down the parcels in sections so that we can actually find a way to digest what the community wanted. Our biggest challenge was that the community didn't know how to look at the site. So we went through a whole planning process, community organizing process, from a 30,000-foot level, look at the whole corridor. We did a linkages study. We want to make sure the community understood what its role was in the context of the region. I mean, I'm giving you the Reader's Digest version of about 15 years of work. But to get to this point, we were able to get there because the community decided that it wanted certain types of amenities, access to affordable housing. They wanted a park, they wanted schools, and we were able to generate that. It was 24 years of work that I went through. I mean, I grew up literally 2 blocks from this site. I knew that Senora Rodriguez from the certain corner who wanted access to certain things. We saw the gang violence that occurred in the 70s and 80s. We understood what wasn't happening for the community. And literally the agencies, the transit agencies, the city council, all those that were supposed to be protecting us were basically running us over. So when we came into office and Gloria started this really pushback on institutional, the biases that come with how they were exercising their powers, we were finally able to push back because we learned the game. I have a master's in urban planning and architecture from UCLA. My colleagues came from different disciplines. So we were able to create this kind of environment. So at this stage, McCormack Barron comes in. They had a strong history of being community oriented. So we were very careful on who we brought to the table and how they treated our community.
Great, thank you. Staying on the topic of community involvement, I'd like to hear from our panelists about how they identify and involve community stakeholders in the process to reach a consensus for these projects. I think we all know that these kind of larger scale projects require community engagement and that the community should be a driving force in what ultimately is built in their communities. But I'd like to hear from our panelists how they identify and involve the folks. And obviously there are 2 distinct communities, city of Lynwood, down in the city of LA. Ed, why don't we hand it back to you, and Antonio, we'll start with Taylor Yards, and we'll go over to John.
I think what was crucial is that when we started seeking out participants, like I said, we went through a whole phase of trying to articulate what the language means. So you have a working class community, folks are working 1, 2 jobs. How are you going to get them to the table? So we literally worked with the local adult schools. They were going through the civic process of learning English. We used the terminology that was being engaged by engineers, planners, architects, so they can have a fighting chance of how to express themselves and how to digest what was happening at a very technical level. What was more crucial for us is that we sought out partners that understood how to essentially maneuver through all the paperwork that comes with government agencies, that comes with city, county, state, federal, regulatory agencies, funding agencies that felt comfortable, have a history of doing that, so that we can at least push it through. On the private side, we were fortunate to have a whole cadre of different developers who wanted to come in, but they were treating us like the suburbs. They weren't looking at us as an urban center. They weren't looking at our history, our culture, our language. It was a nondescript, supermarket side. They were not paying attention to what was unique to the area. So the P3 was a success, I believe, because there was this level of concern and care for the people that were around there. And then, again, DTSC at the time, and no offense to DTSC, but at that time, it was very hard to get them to listen and to cooperate. And so the DTSC today is far different than what we had then. But once they got into a place where we could understand each other, it began to move forward. And I'll stop there.
For the affordable housing developers out there, you'll probably know it. When you go out to a community and you say, I want to build affordable housing, right away people's stereotypes come in of, oh, you're bringing the projects. Oh, you're bringing this. You're bringing, and it's all the misconceptions of what it is. A big part of what we try to do is we show them not just the pictures, but we'll take them. We'll take them to some of our developments, say, no, this is what we're talking about. And I think, you can see sort of the light bulb go off saying, okay, wait a minute, this is nice. And if you can build this, in my neighborhood, that's what I want. So again, that community outreach is not just, in a community room with a slideshow and architects and engineers talking architecture and engineering. It's really show me, and so we did a lot of that with the residents in this neighborhood because, and even to this day, there's still just certain challenges of proposing affordable housing, even in lower income neighborhoods. Back then, the homeless crisis wasn't as big as it is now, but today, there's still the, idea of, hey, we're building housing for people at the extreme, near homeless, and as soon as you can't even get the word homeless out before they say, nope, we don't want it. So again, it's very challenging, but it's really incumbent on us, the project team, the elected officials, to really show the residents what you're proposing, why you're proposing, who it's for. So a lot of that is really important because, like I said, at the end of the day, this is the development's going to be in their neighborhood. We want to make sure that this is something that we've got support from the neighborhood on.
John?
In the case of Lynwood, as I was saying earlier, this particular site, or South Lynwood, if you will, is on the other side of the tracks in a large degree. And so that bifurcation, that physical bifurcation of the freeway has caused some real economic depression. And we've known for a long, long time, even before I was getting involved, that the public was calling for a store, a grocery store. This is technically under the website, you'll find it, it's a food desert, right? And so they've been clamoring that for umpteen years. They were getting very excited, as I said earlier. They had 2 groundbreakings, so they went out and did all the announcements, and yet, as they did further investigation, they realized, we really can't do this. We have a lot more to go, and then you had residents on the site itself that were on a contaminated site that they had to relocate, and still there are a couple that we have to relocate. And as Antonio was mentioning, everybody, we're concerned about housing today, and where do they go? What's the relocation cost? The average family, I think the last number I saw from one of the consultants is that they're probably giving each family in the neighborhood of $30,000 plus to relocate out of basically tear down units. I mean, you wouldn't live there yourselves, but in this environment, it's very much needed location. So we have continued to advise and put on social media what's going on. We've been very open about the application, moving through the process, working with Northgate and developing basically a community effort and plan that is actually in a development agreement. So what they will be doing and providing to the community, the jobs, the local fairs. Northgate is known for this, and they have a pretty good program that they will then open up to the community. And so it's all through that social media, their efforts. We're letting people know we've approved the development agreement. We should start with the ECRG grant probably within the next 30 days or so in terms of moving forward, because we've been working on it really for over a decade.
Great. The next question is really related to funding, timeline, and the public approval process. We know that all those things are key to having a project come to fruition. As we talk about, the public and the private coming together, sometimes we run into, particularly in the city of Los Angeles, Ed, I'm not going to put you on the spot here, but I was working on a project, and our running joke was that we applied, submitted our application during the Obama administration, and were approved under the Joe Biden administration. So 5 years it took for a project to go from application to final approval. And so how important is working with your city council members, your city council, John, to work to expedite the project? And how important is it to have funding mechanisms like the ECRG grant and other sources help to move this project forward? Can you elaborate a little bit?
Sure, thanks, Tony. At the end of the day, you saw the projects earlier, the Riverside Cement Company. We've talked about the Triangle, or your site, Antonio, and Long Beach. I mean, we're talking about decades in the making to get to the point, and the question is, how do you get the funding to do that? And so you have to have a compassionate and understanding community that has a vision, that wants to do it, that continues to push forward and throw a few dollars at it every year to keep it moving. Otherwise, it won't happen. It'll remain fallow. I remember in 1985, I was looking at the intersection of the 405 and the 105 freeway, where you see the Porsche event now and some other things developing. So that's been in the works for 40 odd years, and you don't see it happen until maybe 5 years ago. And so if you want to accelerate a project, you really do need to really get the public-private parties together. There's a lot of public aspects, as I said, the water board, the county, the DTSC, the city. You have to get everybody on board. And then you have to, at the end of the day, have a good community outreach so you make sure that you have residents and others who are stakeholders in your community reaching out to some of these same folks that you have to work with, to let them know, we care, we're here, we need your assistance. Otherwise, without your assistance, it will not happen. Because if you look at the cleanup cost on the North Atlantic, or the Long Beach side rather, the developer can't do it on his own. It's a negative return. There's no land value. So how do you make a project work?
I think a big part of this conference obviously is environmental. That's the big question mark, and for any development, the environmental question mark is a big one. And as they say, until you put the shovel in the ground, you don't really know what you have until you get into the ground. So I think that's a big variable that can make or break a project. Presumably everybody here in EPA and DTSC are here, and I was very happy to hear yesterday, really the commitment to say, let's figure out how to find the resources to develop some of these sites, and they're very hard to develop for a bunch of reasons. Once the cleanup is done, whatever the cleanup is, and you get to that point where you can move forward, if there are sites similar to Taylor Yard where there was no infrastructure, those are also big dollars that people sort of say, okay, well, how expensive could the street be? I've learned more, I went to planning school, but I've learned more about sewers than I ever needed to know or wanted to know about. But infrastructure is very key, and so for this site, The state of California, HCD, has the IIG program, the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program. We got a $15 million grant to be able to build just infrastructure for the site, because you need streets, you need sewers, you need streetlights. I think at this stretch for Taylor Yard, I think we ended up installing 21 new streetlights. And it wasn't the boring gray Cobra head streetlights. They were the decorative, fancy, glossy green LED. And we were happy to put them in because they're beautiful, but they're expensive. So a lot of that is sort of the unanticipated when you look at sites like this. Again, it's not just the housing. Obviously, to build the housing, it's expensive. Costs are going up. Materials are crazy expensive. But it's a lot of that other stuff that you don't see. You sort of have to, it's in the ground. You bury it, but it's important because the site just doesn't work without it. So again, from an environmental standpoint, resources to handle the environmental is key, but it's sort of the next layer of what's needed to support the housing, to support the neighborhood.
In terms of a strategy, our office had about 312 projects in the matrix we were running from north to south. It was a 14 square mile area, 380,000 people. But what I found per project is the ability to identify the stakeholders, not only in the private sector, but also in government. So we would invite the senator, we'd invite the assembly member, we'd invite the supervisor. Every time there's an opportunity to have them together or to appeal to them, we would also invite the heads of the agencies at the same time. So that's a very important moment, because the decision makers who are making decisions on budgets are now talking to the field person on the ground, dealing with their constituents. If you get a multi-jurisdictional presence in any one project, you really helped yourself put together those types of incentives to create that magnet to bring in private monies. The P3 is that. It's a three-legged stool that has to sustain itself financially, politically, and also for, I hate to say it, but we're talking about political careers, people that want to be able to put something on their website, social media. I got this, I got that, I helped out my gente over here, I helped that commute over there, and it's priceless. So I share that with you only because I've seen it work time and time again. I would always give the microphone to whoever wanted to speak first, because I didn't need to speak. I knew what we were doing in our community, but that senator, that assembly member, that county supervisor is going to appreciate that, and they're going to be calling for you to help you push things along or to find funding for the gaps that come along when you want to do affordable housing or other amenities that makes a project successful.
Okay, how are we doing on time? We got a little bit more time? Okay, great. I think we're beyond our 30 minutes, but the conversation is engaging. So, you got 15 more. 15 more? Okay, we're going to keep going. Everybody awake out there? Everybody good? Yes? All right. Okay, everybody, okay. All right. Okay. So, as we heard throughout yesterday and today, these parcels of land that we're talking about, brownfields, I think hold the key to unlocking the future development availability of parcels in our regions. We know that we have an affordable housing crisis, we have a housing crisis. There is a need for these parcels to be reused. How are we working to make that happen in your cities, and what would you advise the DTSC, others, to help move that along? Because those are the parcels that we need to look at. We are in Southern California and in the state of California, we are very, very much in need of new ideas to reuse these brownfields. So, Ed, I'm going to turn it over to you since you spend so much time in government. Let's hear from you, and then we'll pass it down to John and Antonio.
Okay, hopefully my scars don't show too much. But I think one of the key things here is local jurisdictions hold zoning and entitlement processes precious. That's their treasure. No one wants to mess with the local zoning board or the zoning. But to me, if we're really going to be talking about change, that's where we need to go, because it'll directly affect the ability to change the environment that's been sitting fallow, idle, abandoned for all those decades, especially in the Southeast County and in the Northeast area where you have M3 zones juxtaposed to R1, R3s, and people are living there. But now they're living in the bushes, under the bridges, on the sidewalks. So where are they going to go? So from my point of view, if we're going to start talking about real change, and I know I'm going out there, I'm taking a risk here, but looking at what strategy affects our ability to define the reuse of space. The redlining that we talked about yesterday, the passionate speeches we heard yesterday, talk about how we deal with this crisis, it speaks to a real change in how we look at this dynamic of land use and entitlement. Because let's face it, when the decision was being made in the 20s and 30s, and we didn't have a zoning code until the 1940s, people of color were relegated to places where no one else wanted to go. We weren't considered communities of interest. We were the Mexican problem, the Chinese problem, the black problem. We were not considered part of the city. So that institutional shift in mindset is occurring. It's happening right now. So why aren't we using the same tools that they used then to define where people can and cannot live and change and look at it as an opportunity? Brownfields are an opportunity, but let's understand what takes so long in CEQA, what takes so long in a change in planning and zoning and entitlement? Because we're sticking to those same rules that were strapped on us back then. And so our ability to push our elected officials into another layer of concern and effectiveness in changing these zoning patterns, I think is one of the key factors to deal with the timing issue of how long it takes to build these facilities.
As I put on my Lynwood hat, if you will, the fact of the matter is that without a sustainable development, meaning that it brings jobs, provides opportunity, creates a better health and welfare situation because of groundwater contamination, those are all positives that come back to the community that they're clamoring for. And that's what's part of the CCRG grant, right? It's equitable, because there is a certain amount of whether it's economic, cultural, or other things, there's a certain amount of redlining that we need to push beyond. And these are sites that, from a retail and need perspective, are fantastic. I truly believe that when this site is developed with a market, it will be one of their outstanding markets in their chain because of the need. It just happens to be located at a freeway off-ramp, at a rail station, at a bus station. It's all within 800 feet. It's the perfect zone for this type of development. And we've watched it for the last decade plus going unused. And so it needs that motivation. And that's really where the P3 comes in. You get a strong developer and you put in some requirements on the developer. So you're ensuring that it comes back to the community. At one point, we even looked at possibly residential on the site, but there simply wasn't enough room. And so hence it was just the retail component. And then you have the contamination issue too. To what level do you get it to? So we're dealing with multiple issues. But it's definitely something that requires a sustainable perspective. Well, how are you going to do this? And as Ed was saying, we got to fill in these sites because for the most purpose, LA County is fully built out. If you're all in LA County, then you look around, there's not that much land. What's left? The pieces that are fallow because of some problem. And that problem could be 10, 20, 30 years running. And you have to put the effort into it to make it a viable piece for the community and clean it up, quite honestly.
A lot of what Ed said in terms of just the process of approvals and entitlements and CEQA, a lot of that is important. Like I tell my kids, anything's possible with time and money. You can do anything, but you don't have all the time, you don't have all the money. So how do you make these projects viable? One of the discussions that we had a few days ago with Ignacio, I think we were talking about like the purpose of looking at brownfields, and aside from hey, it's the right thing to do, there also has to be an economic analysis. If it doesn't make sense financially, it's very difficult to find, the most altruistic developer to come in and say, hey, yeah, we'll take a go at it. The economics have to work because there's lenders, there's investors that, we're responding to as well. So a lot of that, and again, just time and money, how long do these approvals take, and what is the overall project cost? So to the extent that public agencies can help step in with, again, some of the environmental, some of the infrastructure resources, that's what makes a lot of these developments possible. You look at them and say, okay, well, it could work if we can get X, Y, Z, and we can kind of line up, these items. But without that, a lot of them just really get stuck in a cycle of, now what? How do we move it forward? So yeah, to the extent that we can eliminate or facilitate a lot of those developments, that's really what's going to help drive the development of them.
Yeah, okay. Tony, so if you have any questions, you can start lining up, but I'm going to start off with a question for our panelists, is that...
We've been waiting for you, Luis, for a question.
Yeah, but before your question is that, so you mentioned already need for housing, we're built out, we got to infill, and from the earlier panel, the CEQA and the CAP, is that they're encouraging less driving, hence more density, hence more walking. We are in LA. And even in the Bay Area, when you're talking any kind of density, 4 stories, 5 stories, 6 stories, you get all the woodwork out and you get all this pushback. So given all that dynamic, the love of cars here, the fear of walking, and the complicated land use, the way you're set up, what do you see the challenges are for moving beyond what we see now to something more sustainable?
I think one of the challenges is that when you look at who's making the real decisions, we have to understand the dynamic of the voter base and who votes and who doesn't. I hate to get back to that, but I'll give an example. As I was leaving office in my last 3 years, we introduced 4 new zones that had to do with transit-oriented district, greenways. We were giving bonuses to the FAR, increasing FARs, if they can increase the number of units for affordable housing. And we eliminated the parking requirement. But to be able to trigger the parking requirement, you had to have a transit program. So we were looking at TDMs, transit demand management practices, and we incorporate that into the code book. But what happens, what I found out later as I left office, 3 or 4 years later, DOT wasn't speaking to Public Works, wasn't speaking to, the departments were not accepting these changes. So a major step, I think, is going to be how we, as advocates trying to promote these new environments of brownfields, is how does the respective cities stimulate these changes and creating time frames that make it more cost effective to make these changes, because they have the power to make those changes. But you have to ask, why aren't the decision makers doing that?
Do we have anything to add to that, or should we take some questions, John? Let's take some questions before we run out of time. Okay, Luis, you're on.
Thank you, Tony. Antonio brought a good point earlier that, in his work, he had never thought he'd encounter so many sewer issues, or got to know so much about sewers and infrastructure. And in all the previous talks, we've all discussed about how important it is to engage the community early on, to get buy-in, to help them be part of the process, to help them develop their vision. But I think just as importantly, we need to also visit the public works and the engineers to see what capacity are in the streets. LA, as much as Huntington Park, maybe Lynwood as well, we have 100-year-old infrastructures. And if you recall, Ed, back in the day when we first started, I came in '89 in LA, and my first task was to rezone through the AB 283 down zoning of Northeast LA, South LA, because besides redlining, there were also injustices on zoning where they were putting all the high-end zones for densifying these neighborhoods, whereas Hancock Park was preserved with its estate planning zoning where nobody can move in with their affordable housing developments. But yet they were sticking Northeast LA with these high-end zones, R3, R4, and the only reason that they brought it down, one of the reasons they brought it down, was they finally checked the sewer capacities. There's no way that these monstrosity developments can happen in Northeast LA. with this type of infrastructure that was there. So that was one of the reasons why they downzoned from R3 to the RD 1.5s to the R2s. And now, I mean, HCD and SCAG wants us to upzone everything, but, you know, to accommodate all this housing. But nobody's really taking a look at the infrastructure capacity in a lot of cases, and that's important. That was all I wanted to say, and if you guys have any more feedback on that, thank you.
That sounds like a statement, but we'll get some feedback up here.
It's an opportunity, Luis. The fact that that was happening, we were able to fund a major sewer line. You can drive a truck through it, down San Fernando Road, all the way down to Main Street, turn south and going towards Long Beach. And this was a huge pipeline. But what that did, it triggered a lot of concern on the local folks and saying, you guys are up to something, because what's going on here? And I said, look, the truth is, in the winter rains, when we have those really strong downpours, the sewer can't handle it, the waterway can't handle it, so all the excrement from our homes was actually bubbling up into the street. And the kids at the local grammar schools going to school were getting sick. And so it became a health issue. We went to the feds, the state, and we funded this project. But it unfortunately took our children to get sick to get to that point.
And just real quick on infrastructure, yeah, if you've got a large scale project, if you've got a small project, you know, make that visit to Public Works, because they're sort of that agency that everybody sort of forgets about until the last minute, and then all of a sudden you got to widen the street by 2 feet. Doesn't sound like much, but all of a sudden that impacts your setbacks and your driveways, and so Public Works, in their defense, they're not always sort of the deliver bad news. I mean, they're responding to certain things like, hey, this street needs to be bigger because there's too much traffic. This street should be smaller because we want it more walkable. So they are in a no-win situation. But it's an important discussion to be had early, again, for anything large scale, because of everything that you don't see that's underground that may or may not be able to handle what you're proposing.
Good afternoon.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Hi, my name's Jennifer Ganata. I'm with Communities for a Better Environment. I'm one of the attorneys there. But I did have a question about the city of Lynwood and the site there. And because I've been actually looking at a lot of housing elements, and I noticed that site was actually listed in the inventory, site inventory for housing. I'm wondering also, like, so the decision to do the market over housing, and I guess, like, what were the factors in terms of thinking about remediation of that land and not going with the housing? And also, I was confused as to whether the city owned the property or if they had a stake in it, and wouldn't that, if the city did own it, wouldn't that go under Surplus Lands Act, or?
Those are all good questions. Starting with the first one, the city technically does not own the land. The land was privately owned sold by one party to another, and then it went to a trustee who went bankrupt, so it became court receivership. And so the site has been a location environmental concern for eons, and to get it, as I said earlier, there was a look at some residential in addition to the market, but there simply wasn't enough land without condemning more property and using it. And most cities don't like to use eminent domain, obviously, but you can for housing, or road work, but typically they don't. One of the other items that I wanted to just mention, based upon the previous question, and maybe some of what you might be looking at from our housing element, every city has to deal with SB 9 and 10 and ADUs. And the infrastructure issue is significant. As we approve, we still live in LA, so we still need cars. In that particular city, other cities, our offices were located in a Victorian home in 1888 in Boyle Heights. We have a parking problem there. So everybody is experiencing what we are, except some of the other, what I would say, economically better communities, right, where you haven't seen a lot of ADUs take place. But that's a fact that we have to live with, and we're trying to figure out how do you best deal with that. You know, are there going to be programs that you encourage people to have fewer cars? We don't know how. How do you deal with that? The sewer systems. they're not there. They're not ready to handle the amount of conversion that's taking place, or the water systems. So the sustainable aspect is still, while we approved it all from a state level, now we're trying to figure out at the ground level, street level, how do you address all this? Sorry, I couldn't complete all the things.
Thank you. Okay, do we have any other questions? All right, I think I'd like to thank Ed, John, and Antonio for their participation today. Let's give them a round of applause.